Hi, welcome to Bookies. Today we're going to talk about To Wake the Giant by Jeff Shaara. This is a historical fiction that I'm going to award 4 stars out of 5. It's very, very good. It just doesn't quite reach the gold standard that I found in Gary Jennings' Aztec, or Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, or Gates of Fire by Pressfield, or Shogun by James Clavell. I recommend all of those to you, by the way. Notwithstanding, it's very, very good. So let's take a look, and maybe I can tell you a little bit of why I think it's a very good read. Published in 2020, this novel takes on the Japanese Imperial Navy's attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii that occurred on December 4th, 1941. Shaara's genre is the historical fiction, and this is the first one of his that I've read. I have another one right here that eventually I will get to, but I like to balance out my historical books and historical fiction books with general fiction literature. So it'll be a while till I get to this next one, but this being my first read of a Shaara novel, I came away impressed. Shaara presents his novel from the perspective of 3 main characters. The first is Secretary of State Cordell Hull. He's located in Washington, D.C., and essentially his interactions are with the Japanese diplomatic corps, specifically Ambassador Nomura. The next character is Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was responsible for planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. And those 2 characters were both real historical figures, real people. In the writing of this novel, Shaara was given unprecedented access to the archives at the Pearl Harbor War Memorial and other first-person resources. So he really writes with regard to Admiral Yamamoto and Secretary Hull from a real position of strength, because he has a lot of historical data to back up what he's doing with those 2 particular characters. Our third main character is Seaman Apprentice Tommy Biggs. He's a fictionalized character coming from Palatka, Florida. And essentially his story in entering the Navy was that there was very little economic opportunity in Palatka, and that he really wanted to get away and see the world, but at the same time earn enough money that he could send home to his parents to assist them. It's a very common American story with regard to why people enter the military. What I do appreciate about Shaara is he avoids a very typical trap of authors of historical fictions, in which they can present characters as completely one-dimensional. Admiral Yamamoto is not a one-dimensional character. He's not a fictionalized villain in any sense. Rather, he's a reasonable person, and he understands the task given to him, and he understands his honor, he understands his duty, but he has his doubts. With regard to Ambassador Nomura, as he's relating to Secretary Hull, Shaara really gives us the perspective that Nomura is somewhat frustrated, not with the Americans, but with his own government, in that it seems evident that his own government is keeping him in the dark with regard to the planning of the attack at Pearl Harbor. And so Nomura is essentially saying very peaceful things to Secretary Hull, which aren't true, but Nomura doesn't really know that. And the interesting thing about Nomura is that you do get the sense that he's a serious man. And what I mean by that is, even if he did have foreknowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor, he would have done his duty. It's not like he would have betrayed the war planning of his own country in order to make nice with Secretary Hull. So Nomura is presented as very realistic. He's a sympathetic character, in my opinion. And the same goes for Admiral Yamamoto. And from my perspective, Yamamoto is the most engaging character in this novel. Yamamoto is not a war hawk. He doesn't want war with the United States. Rather, it's people in his government that are the war hawks. They are the ones that want war with the United States. Yamamoto is presented by Shaara as being very realistic. He knows that even if the attack on Pearl Harbor goes off with 100% success, the best case scenario is that it would cripple the Pacific Fleet enough to give the Japanese Army 6 months to advance its war aims and secure oil and rubber. That's the best case scenario for Yamamoto. In contrast, the warhawks in his government think that by crippling the Pacific Fleet, they will win the war. They will create such a public perception that in the United States that the United States will sue for peace. And this leads to a really interesting point of view that Shaara presents, and it's racial stereotypes. Now, we know that racial stereotypes are silly, they're unjust. But Shaara makes the point here that racial stereotypes in the context of war planning and warfare are dangerous. So to illustrate, the Japanese are presented as considering themselves racially superior to essentially everybody. And their perspective of Americans is that Americans are soft, they're dishonorable, and they wouldn't have the will to fight a protracted war. And with regard to the Americans, Shaara does a pretty accurate job being an American. I think this is largely true, even though it's a stereotype. Americans are considered rather cocky, we're sure of ourselves, we understand our economic might and our capability to wage war, and from the American perspective in the context of Pearl Harbor, it would be simply inconceivable that a little country like Japan would wage war against the United States. Well, you can see from that stereotype and the judgments that result from that stereotype, that is incorrect. And Japan did attack the United States. It was willing to wage war against, the bully in the room, the United States. While these racial stereotypes, both on the side of the Japanese and the Americans, do have a historical basis, Shaara doesn't provide those to any of the three main characters. In contrast to the general view from the Japanese that the Americans are soft and they would be unwilling to engage in protracted war, Yamamoto completely disagrees. He sees them as a worthy opponent, an honorable opponent, and he fully agrees that Japan would have no ability to win a protracted war against the United States. The best it could do is put itself in a better position to fight that war and then sue for peace. And lastly, from a personal perspective, with regard to Tommy Biggs, I really did enjoy that. As noted before, Tommy Biggs is an amalgamation of the experience of a lot of enlisted sailors during World War II, and particularly at Pearl Harbor. And very much what Shaara presents is accurate. And what I mean by that is my dad was an enlisted sailor in the United States Navy. I was a naval officer myself. And the experience of Navy life is presented as very accurate. And Briggs is presented as essentially being bullied by a senior enlisted member. And unfortunately, those things can occur. You know, you don't just get beat up and bullied while you're in boot camp or officers' candidate school. It can occur while you're actually on duty. It's unfortunate. That's not proper leadership, but it does occur with people that are poor leaders. And those people, unfortunately, can't exist in the Navy. So the experience that Shaara provides to us is very accurate. And one quibble I have with it, though, is Shaara has senior enlisted speak to Tommy Biggs, a more junior enlisted person, with the appellation of Mr. The Navy is particular amongst our armed forces in that Mr. is an appropriate appellation, but only for an officer. So it's the equivalent of sir. So a senior enlisted member would never refer to a junior enlisted member as Mr. because it's essentially calling him Sir, which is something that you only do towards officers. It's a small quibble, but it did kind of signal to me that it's very likely that Shaara never spent time in the Navy. And once again, I mean, he may have spent time in the military, but the Navy is unique with regard to that appellation. I remember being at the Army JAG School in Charlottesville, and a junior enlisted person called me Mr., and the Army officers I was present with were shocked by that. They're, it's like, well, he should have called you Sir. No, Mr. is an appropriate appellation for an enlisted person to say to a naval officer. It's a small quibble. It doesn't impact the view of the book, but every time I'd see it, I just kind of go, "Argh." But that's my problem, not yours. I'd like to take a minute to talk about the battle narrative. Unfortunately, in a lot of historical fictions that have the military as its subject matter, battle narrative is done poorly. And that's not the case in To Wake a Giant. I think Shaara does an admirable job. The pitfall for a lot of authors of historical fiction is they short character development in order to protract battle narrative. And when that's done, you're really not invested in the characters very much, and the battle narrative becomes really long and gets really boring. Shaara doesn't do that. To the contrary, 3/4 of the book is character development. It's the buildup. And so Shaara really presents kind of this tension by the character development, and that you're wanting the attack to begin, so you can kind of experience that. And he does an excellent job of that. The battle narrative also is given from the perspective of primarily from Seaman Apprentice Biggs, because he's the enlisted person that's stationed on the USS Arizona that was attacked and sunk. So you really get the character's perspective on the battle. Another pitfall I find in historical fiction that has military as a subject matter is essentially that the author will develop the characters and you get invested in the characters, and then the battle starts and the narrative becomes generalized. It's like you're looking down on the battle from a 30,000 foot point of view, and that's not what you want. You want to experience what the main characters would have experienced during that battle. So the battle narrative, primarily from the perspective of Seaman Apprentice Biggs, not necessarily Yamamoto, because Yamamoto was not present with the fleet of the Japanese Imperial Navy when it actually attacked Pearl Harbor. So Yamamoto's participation is essentially in getting reports back after the attack occurred. Lastly, what I'm appreciative of with Shaara is that he's got an appendix, a biography, in which he lists his sources, not in great detail, but he will list the first-person accounts that are available for the attack on Pearl Harbor, both Japanese and American. And that's really helpful, because if you want to read further, if you actually want to read the source documents, you want to leave historical fiction and move to actual history, this provides you a good first step to do that. And so I'm always appreciative when an author will do that for us. So with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. This is a very good historical fiction. That being said, if you're watching this, I am not trying to convince you to read something that you're not interested in. So if military subject matter does not appeal to you, skip the novel and go read something that you will enjoy. Life is short. We should read what we want to read. And because this particular novel, because of its limited subject matter being military, it's not like what I describe as the gold standards of historical fiction that will cross genre and appeal to somebody that likes fantasy or literary fiction. This is not that novel. That's why it's very good, but not excellent. The fault is not the author's, it's just that the author chose military subject matter. I'm always going to encourage you to cross genre, read things that you're not necessarily familiar with. You know, if you like fantasy books, hey, try an historical fiction or literary fiction, or vice versa, because it'll broaden your perspective and it'll really build your critical thinking capability. But with regard to this particular novel, if you are okay with or you really enjoy military subject matter, definitely read this novel. I think you'll really enjoy it. It's well written. It covers the subject matter of the attack on Pearl Harbor quite well. If you're a reader that's thinking, well, he's kind of got me half convinced to read a historical fiction, but I don't really have an interest in military, I'm going to point you to the gold standards. And with that, I'm going to wish you a good day. God bless.